Okay, welcome to this book launch of two books in the Liu Institute series in Chinese Christianities. My name is Alex Chow. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. I'm also the series editor for this book series. We're grateful also for the support of the Liu Institute of Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame Press, and also Taiwan Theological College and Seminary here, who's hosting us for this event. And also this is part of the Taiwan World Christianity Group meeting. So we're grateful for that group for their support as well. So today we're launching two books in the Liu Institute Chinese Christianity series. We're launching Chris Pike's this man right here, Chris Pike's work on following Christ and Confucius, Wang Mingdao and Chinese Christianity, as well as Jonathan Seitz, his work on Protestant missionaries in China, Robert Morrison, and early Sinology. We also have with us Dr. Christie Chow, who is author of the first of the books in the series, Schism, Seventh-day Adventism in Post-Denominational China. We're also pleased that later this year, in November, we have a fourth book coming out by Justin Tse, entitled Sheets of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim. And that book is looking at Cantonese Protestants in San Francisco, Vancouver, and Hong Kong, and looking at their public discourse. So it's my pleasure today to be able to launch this series or these books in the series. And I think I thought it'd be useful as the editor of the series just to briefly introduce why this series exists. Because oftentimes, when prospective authors are looking to publish a book, they look at what publishers are publishing, what kinds of books, and what kind of series are out there, right? And one of the things that several years ago, myself and the acquisitions editor at Notre Dame Press, we were chatting about things, and we realized that a lot of the book series that included topics on Chinese Christianity tended to be follow one of three major themes. Okay, either it was very focused on China and not anywhere else. Okay, or it was primarily historical in terms of discipline and didn't really engage other disciplines. Or it was focused on a particular confession or tradition. So whether that be Protestantism only or Catholicism, or in China, the three self only, or house churches, or things like this. And so we really wanted to be able to see the possibility that we can study the phenomena, if you will, of Chinese Christianity and its multifacetedness across these various boundaries. And part of this was coming out of the American Academy of Religion, the Chinese Christianities group. There was a lot of discussion in that group about trying to cross these boundaries. And in many ways, the three authors sitting here actually represent, as well as Justin Tse's work, represents kind of a pushing of these various boundaries. So if I work backwards here, if you think about the confessional and the traditional kind of boundaries, Christie's book in particular on Schism and Seventh-day Adventism is a great book. The title itself is a giveaway. Okay, Schism. Okay, this splitting of churches, right? And it's focused on Seventh-day Adventism, which there's not that many studies on Seventh-day Adventism of Chinese Christianity by itself. Moreover, it's looking at how Seventh-day Adventism has grown and schismed in China in particular, down with house church as well as registered three self forms. Also, we have, of course, many Protestant works, but also upcoming next year, we'll have a work on Catholic developments of Christianity. If you think about the disciplines, crossing the boundaries of disciplines, as I said, most of the works were very historical. Of course, Chris Pike's work is engaging the biography of Wang Mingdao, but is also reflecting on some of the theological questions that are coming out of Wang Mingdao's life as he's such an important figure in terms of Christianity in China. And Jonathan Saitz's work, of course, is looking at not only mission history, but also sinological studies. And how do we perceive sinology? Can we challenge that in some ways? And Justin Say's work is another one, as well as Christie's work, which includes social scientific methods in the mix of the methodologies. So that challenges, in some ways, the disciplinary boundaries, if you will. And lastly, the China-centric approach. Of course, all the books that have come out thus far are China-centric, I have to admit. Although Morrison,
pre-China.
He's kind of mainland China kind of effect. But most notably, the book that's coming out in November, Justin Say's work, is looking at the diaspora and the cross national engagement of Chinese Christianity. And of these three kind of themes, these boundaries, they obviously, these different boundaries help to define projects, but trying to break them down help to broaden our understanding and the discourse, the academic discourse of Chinese Christianity. And so it really raises a question for myself in particular, as a scholar of Chinese Christianity, is asking, does looking across the boundaries challenge and help me to understand better the very specific particularity of my study of Chinese Christianity, right? Through this breadth and through this diversity. But it also raises interesting questions, because are we speaking about a singular Chinese Christianity, or, as a series suggests, the possibility of a multiplicity of Chinese Christianities? Are there a multiplicity of Chineseness, if you will? We're in Taiwan, so maybe I should speak of Taiwanness as well. Multiplicity of a Chineseness, but also a multiplicity of Christianities, if you will. And that's why this series exists. But even more so, it is because of this that I'm really grateful to be able to launch these two great books, to add to what I hope is a growing series in many ways. They're beautiful and have their particularities of their own right. But I think as coming together as a series, they speak to a bigger picture of how we can be enriched by the diversity that exists within and beyond Chinese Christianities. So that's my introduction. And I'm going to turn the time over to Chris Pike here, who will speak about his work.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone, if you're in Taiwan, and good evening to everyone who's in Toronto or Indiana, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Alex and the Leo Institute and University of Notre Dame Press for all the support they provided us with, bringing the work of many years to print, and now to Jonathan and the Taiwan Theological College and Seminary for hosting this event. And this is just a really exciting opportunity for us to share our work. And it's not an exaggeration to say this is many, many years of work. So thank you for your support in that. My goal for the next few minutes is to share about this work, which is Following Christ and Confucius. And it's focused on a man named Wang Mingdao. And if you're not familiar with him, he is pretty universally considered the spiritual father of the Chinese house church movement. And so I came to Taiwan 14 years ago, and I had just completed studies on another theologian. And I came to Taiwan fairly fresh and not incredibly familiar with the Chinese context. And so I went and talked to a man who was my pastor at the time, and I said, who are the most influential Chinese Christians? And he gave me three names, and Zhang Sung, Wang Mingdao, and Ni Tuosheng, or Watchman Nee. And so in my research, I found that Zhang Sung and Watchman Nee already had a significant coverage. But when I looked at the character of Wang Mingdao, who I realized was the spiritual father of the house church network, there was nothing that filled the void of an entire life biography. So what existed were pieces of that story, but nothing had really shown the full life. And so I wanted to write that work because over the years, years and years of studying and learning about him, he's a fascinating figure and incredibly influential. And so as I began to read the works of him and other people about him, I realized that there was a significant disconnect between the Chinese literature and the English literature on him. And when you read what he wrote, you'll see that there is a significant influence of Confucianism on his thought and the way he processed his life, in fact. And that was almost entirely edited out of anything that was written in English on him. So in 2013, I believe it was, a man named Xingfu Zheng, who was a professor of Chinese Christianity at the University of Hong Kong, published a book called Wang Mingdao's Last Confession. And that really showed the influence of Confucius on Wang Mingdao's thought. So there was an initial biography of the first 50 years of his life. There was another biography of the last 40 years of his life. And then this later book, which really showed after he came out of prison, what was the Confucian influence on his Christian theology. So no one had put all of that together in one volume. And for a person like me, I was really interested in having it all in one place. So that was the task that I set before myself in writing this book. So what it does is it looks at everything that's happened previous to this in the introduction of what's been written. So it's called Wang's Life So Far. And I summarize everything that's been written so far. And then in the first chapter, it focuses on his early years, his upbringing right at the beginning at the Boxer Uprising, and where he loses his father due to the Boxer Uprising, and he begins a life dependent on missionary Christianity. That's the first chapter. And then as we get into the second chapter, begins the break, where he realizes that he needs to be an independent Chinese Christian, completely disconnected from missionary Christianity. And so this is where he really develops his reputation as an outstanding writer and preacher and itinerant evangelist. And then when you get to the third chapter, we begin to engage his years of conflict with the Japanese as they were occupying China, his region of Beijing at the time, and his ability to resist them, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. And then later with the Three Self movement in the early 1950s, how he continued to resist participation in the Three Self. Chapter 4 then begins with the prison years, where he was arrested and then was released because he passively indicated that he would attend Three Self but never did, and then was rearrested. And so these begin his prison years. And this is an interesting chapter of his life where he was really able to look at the Confucian tradition in Chinese history and integrate the ideas of Christian theology with Confucian history. So, and then in the last chapter of the biography part, there is his spiritual father years, where he is released in Shanghai and becomes this incredible spiritual leader to the house church movement. So people from all over the world, and especially China, come visit him in Shanghai in these later years, including Billy Graham, who he didn't want to visit with. And that part of the story is quite funny. Then at the end of it, there is a summary of his theology, the really salient points like his thoughts on the Trinity, his ecclesiology, his thoughts on suffering, all of these things culminating in his theological thought, and really showing how both traditions, the Confucian tradition and the Christian tradition, form that theology, and thus qualifies him to be considered a significant Confucian Christian. And then at the very end, there is a list of all of his writings, because that's particularly inaccessible in some parts of the world to understand what is it that this man has written. So all of that to say, this is a restructured biography which tries to show Wang Mingdao both as a a person unsevered from his Confucian tradition, but also a significant Chinese theologian in the Christian tradition, forging a new way forward in China, independent of missionary Christianity. So that was the task at hand, and I'm really thankful that University of Notre Dame Press has released this book, and thankful to all of you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Chris, for that. Wonderful introduction to your book and both your journey as well as Wang Mingdao's journey. We're going to switch over to our next speaker. Just a note for everybody who's online as well as here in the room. If you have questions, do keep thinking about that. We'll have a little bit of a discussion time. You could, if you're online, you could type it into the chat and I'll see it. If you're in here, you could do that, or you could raise your hand and we could turn on your mics. Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan Seitz, go for it.
Thank you so much, Alex, and Chris. Also, thank you for your reflection. I thought it's a great introduction to your book. This project, it kind of it came out of pieces of my dissertation. That for my dissertation, I had looked at Liang Fa, is the often called like the first ordained Chinese pastor. It was just the 200th anniversary of his ordination, and he's the first Chinese Christian we have where we have his own writing that we can read and reflect about. But in that process, I just kept finding really interesting materials about the early LMS mission. And that included like a collection of tracts and an early catechism and an early tract from the Morrison's, the very first materials Morrison wrote and translated with local helpers when he went to China in 1807. And I found a set of journals, an English and a Chinese language journal, and the dictionary. There was Morrison published the first big Chinese English dictionary. It was another one of these huge collaborative projects. There's Andrew West edited a Morrison's library that he collected. So I kept finding all these things where they were a lot of like one-off projects that other scholars had done where they'd written about his library or about his dictionary or about the Bible or about the diplomatic missions. And what it came down to is I was interested in sort of two big questions. The first question was, how did this first generation of Protestant missionaries and local converts, how did they translate Christianity into Chinese? So this is kind of like the first draft Chinese Christian theology, and that's the early chapters. And then secondly, I was interested in how the missionaries attempted to make sense of China and translate it back into English for Western audiences. So maybe like Chris's, my book is chronological, where it traces kind of the work over the history, but it's also my main interest was kind of like how did Morrison, Mill, Liang Fa, how did they understand China, and also how did they translate Christianity into Chinese. And I ended up picking kind of three themes to look at to characterize this period. It's kind of a funny period, like it's before the Opium Wars, so most of the work takes place outside of China, which is, we were talking about, that it was sort of pre-China in some ways. It's also not the beginning of, like often when we date Sinology in English, we date it to kind of Max Mueller and James Legge and this kind of like history of religions or religious studies project that really begins in like the 1860s and 70s and afterwards. So this is all the period before that. But I just found the topics that they discussed were just always really interesting to me. That it was, as an example, in the Chinese magazine, there's a sermon that it seems to be Morrison writes, where he uses a German story about a father who wants to kick out his grandfather to discuss filial piety and to discuss following the commandment to honor your father and mother. So there were pieces like that. There's a children's book that Morrison authored that was kind of done as a dialogue between him and his children over, it offers like a history of China, and then it also talks about a lot of comparative themes. So he will often have a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand approach. So he'll talk about foot binding in China, but he'll also talk about women's fashion and corsets in England. So there are pieces of that are interesting. And so the three themes that I came up finally with, the first theme I used was that this was kind of an amateur effort. Like the missionaries were not setting out to write Sinology, but in effect, they were the first chapter of English language Sinology. The second theme I looked at was that they were missionary in their approach, that they were doing this for the spread of Christianity, and that most of their work was related to Christianity in some way. So Morrison did this dictionary, for instance, was sponsored by the East India Company, but it was also part of a larger effort to translate the Bible and to develop tools for missionaries to use. And then the third term I use is the term Orientalist, which I don't mean in a pejorative way, but in a descriptive way, that the first missionaries, Morrison, Milne, and others, they're new to China, they're new to Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. They don't really understand a lot of things. Like one of the dialogue points Chris and I were just having was about Confucianism, that Morrison and Milne they have some interest in Confucianism, but they're looking at kind of everything. They're looking at the triads and religious texts about merit and demerit, and they're looking at kind of anything they can find and collect, they're trying to understand. So in doing that, they often present a very idealized or a very stereotyped image of China, but they offer it with maybe more nuance than I expected. And I think it becomes the beginnings of sort of the later professional Sinology. So these were the three main themes that I developed, kind of running throughout the whole book. And I'm just really grateful to be at this point. This project in some ways is over 20 years old. It kind of came out of my dissertation, and I'm not always great at finishing things. So it's wonderful to be at a point where I can finish it. And there were a lot of people who helped me along the way. This is the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan institution. So as an example, there's a famous senior historian in the church here, had been a librarian at Harvard and collected a huge collection of Protestant tracts, John Lai. And my friend Tsai Mingwei also introduced me to one of the Luo Yiren, I think one of the famous older biblical scholars he had collections of early Bibles from Hong Kong and from other locations, so that he could just kind of, as an example, he handed me the photocopy, the copy of the harmony that Morrison copied out of they had this harmony from the Catholics, and he copied it out. Half was his writing and half was his tutor's writing. So I'm really grateful also to Alex at Notre Dame, and to my wife Emily and my father, who both read portions of this, and just for the continuity of these groups and keeping this going, and with a mix of prodding and patience. So.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It occurred to me that what you were describing of these early missionaries, especially the amateurish thing, is something that a lot of academics wrestle with. Actually, much of our work tends to be a little amateurish, and there's this imposter syndrome, right? But I think the flip side of that was your own personal story in writing this, because it kind of draws out how we do stand and walk on the shoulders of giants, right? And that we're shaped by and influenced by so many others, and in the journeys to produce our works and stuff. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for that. We turn our attention to Christie Chow, who will give a brief response.
Thank you very much. So I was given this task 24 hours before, and so I'm not going to burden my audience with a long presentation. But first of all, thank you for involving me in this panel. And this is the first time I thank Alex for the leadership of launching this series, because when I published my book, it was during the COVID period, and I didn't get a chance to thank him personally. But thank you very much. This is really good job. So I managed to read the books last night, not the whole text, but enough for me to offer three responses to these two books. First of all, actually it's four. First of all, the materiality of the book. Highly accessible, big fonts, easy to read. And that is why I managed to read the text last night. Oftentimes when we publish a book and we choose a publisher, we don't consider the material side of the book, but these are good works. So highly recommend, big fonts, accessible. So I think that the two works stands out. First of all, because these two figures, actually it's three, right? Robert Morrison and William Mill, and then Wang Mingdao. When they began their ministry in China, they were in a big transition in their life. And so, first of all, the context of these figures provided in the book really help us to understand the environment and the difficult situation and the life setting they were having when they produced all these theological writings. And so, first of all, the context in the book really helps us to reflect on these big names. Oftentimes, they are familiar names to scholars. But then, because of the context that the books provide, it helps us to understand that they are really complicated figures working in a very complicated situation. This is the first thing that stands out to me. The second thing is the new sources. I think both of our authors have already shared how they work very hard to dig out new sources in order to revisit these figures. And for the case of Wang Mingdao, because of Professor Dr. Yingfu Zheng's book on Wang Mingdao, The Last Confession, he was able to present us a really new Wang Mingdao that the older publication didn't mention, which is a very Confucianist way of trying to link Christianity and Chinese cultures, history, sages, and experience in order to help Chinese society to move forward after the 1980s period. How are we going to teach the Chinese Christian to live a moral life in a new political situation? And I think that entry point is really help us to know more about Wang Mingdao, not just a very, quote, fundamentalist Protestant church preacher or church leader. Actually, he is a Christian, a Chinese Christian intellectual working on synthesizing the Chinese cultures, Confucianisms in history in order to help the Chinese Christians to live a moral life. And I think the moral take in Morrison's work and William Mill's work is also stands out in this text, which is when they write the checks, they're concerned about the children, the family, and all the so-called bad Chinese customs. So how could Christianity help the Chinese society to have a new moral take when they learn from the Christian morality, but also from their own context? And I think this moral take is really stands out from the books. And the third thing that I take from these two works is the relationship between Christianity and Chinese culture. And I think both works showed us that the relationships can be really complicated. They can be compatible in the case of Wang Mingdao, which is he is able to use all these traditional Chinese stories and history to talk about Christianity and Chinese Christian moral life. But also during the course of translation, in the case of Morrison, he met quite a lot of challenges in finding the right terms to express his ideas, not just to the Chinese, but also to the British and the churches back in Scotland. And I think these four elements the materiality of the book, the context-related description, and also the news sources and the relationship between two ideology, the Christianity and Chinese cultures. From the book, you can have all these good things, and that's why I highly recommend these two books. This is all I have. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Christie. That was wonderful. That it goes to show that we could always cram for exams. And I mean, those are brilliant points, all of them really. We're going to go into a time of discussion now, and I see Richard Fox Young has put in some questions in the chat. We have a Dr. Father in the online chat. But before we go there, I'd like to just open up the conversation. Please do add more questions to the chat or raise your hands here in the room. To start the conversation, maybe one of the themes that Christie mentioned was the engagement with culture, right, and Confucianism and whatnot. And it strikes me that both Wang Mingdao as well as Morrison and Milne and others in Jonathan's work, both books highlight spiritual fathers. Okay, there's spiritual fathers in different ways. Spiritual fathers in mission history. Early Liang Fa, as a early convert, and we have a spiritual father, especially in terms of the house church movement in China today and for so many generations. Now, this is kind of a sales pitch question, okay? But how does your book help later generations to be good filial children, if you will? How can they learn from each of your books in ways that they wouldn't have, in terms of mission history or missionaries, or in terms of Christianity in China or house church Christians? I don't know how you would like to go first. Okay.
That's a good question. I think that the heart of that is that we can see Wang Mingdao as a person who is completely unsevered from his cultural context. And so later generations who follow Wang Mingdao as a father figure, spiritual father figure, which so many sources describe him as the patriarch of the house church movement, the father figure, the spiritual father of the house church movement. They look to him as a person who was faithful under persecution and suffering, not always recognizing the fact that he was so unsevered from his Confucian background, and yet was a committed Christian, as committed as you could possibly be. He was willing to die for his faith. He didn't, but he lived through 23 years of imprisonment, came out, and then continued to minister to people who would come to visit him in Shanghai out of his at his house church and in his apartment. And so what these people who came to visit him in Shanghai realized was that this was a Chinese Christian figure who had significantly integrated Confucian thought and morality with Chinese theology and ethics. And so that is an incredible resource that people can go to understand how this man became such a legendary figure in Chinese Christianity. So that was fascinating to me, especially as I was reading his biography and stories about him, where he would suddenly reference Wen Tianqiang and the Song of Righteousness. And, having grown up in Canada, I'd never read Wen Tianqiang and the Song of Righteousness. That was completely, I had no idea what this even was. So I had to look up what that meant. And it's a retelling of all the great stories of heroic Chinese throughout the years who lived righteous lives. And Wang Mingdao integrated that in his Christian theology. And so people who read his work or this book will come to find that there's an incredible resource that's available to Chinese Christians and all Christians here. People who are interested in history of China find a fascinating figure in Wang Mingdao, I think.
So I think that's a great question, Alex. And one of the challenges I've had has been to balance like how mission history relates to Christianity in East Asia, like how those two pieces go together. And it's a real dance because almost all the anniversaries that are celebrated are connected to, in the early life of the church, are connected to missionaries. And then at the same time, there's a realization in the field that like missionaries are a tiny part of the actual growth of the church, that most of the growth comes from leaders like Liang Fa, not from missionaries like Morrison. So I think there is a way where often missionaries are held up as kind of like a model to be remembered, and they represent this kind of leap that takes place with Christianity sometimes where it moves from place to place. So they're often heralded for that. So I have like some ambivalence about it. You know, I talked about how originally I wrote on Liang Fa, and he's very hard to write a biography of because there's so little written material that can beyond his biographer. And as an example, like for Morrison, for the 200th anniversary in 2007, there were continuous celebrations in multiple places, and I went to a number of those and appreciated them. And I think in December was the 200th anniversary of Liang Fa's ordination, but I was not remembered anywhere. So it's always kind of, I think there's a tension where the missionaries are remembered because they're the first point of contact and they're the start of this. They're often seen as the starting point of the story, but sometimes they also overwhelm the story. So that's a real challenge. And I struggled out with that with the title of the book also, of how to capture the group work that was taking place, where my theory was kind of like all of these early projects were missionaries and local people working together. But so much of the material comes from what was collected and organized by Morrison that it sort of becomes the narrative. I don't know if that makes sense.
Great, thank you very much. We have two questions from Richard Young online. I'll read the two questions for the two of you. The first one is to Chris, and it's simply a question of how would you compare and contrast your work on Wang Mingdao with Tom Harvey's Acquainted with Grief. And then for Jonathan, question is, how is Morrison remembered in contemporary Sinology? Is he forgotten? Is he revered? Has his legacy somehow stood the test? Is he even cited in scholarship nowadays?
Okay. Sure, yeah. I'd say one of the things that was interesting for me was to have Morrison next to James Legg. Like one of the Dr. Young remembers, the outside member of my committee was Norman Girardeau, and I also knew Lauren Pfister. I know him pretty well. So there's a way where that there's been kind of a case made for, and Alex has also edited and written on Legg, that in some ways he's the one who kind of becomes the official Sinology. But I would say Morrison shows up very often in, you know, if you study the triads, or if you study the printing press, or if you study education in Southeast Asia, or if, you know, English education in Southeast Asia, or if you study the diplomatic missions, that there's like Morrison pops up over and over again. That was part of the challenge, was to figure out how do these diverse firsts, how do they form a picture of that generation of Sinology? So I hope that makes sense. Like I think he's not really considered a Sinologist, but his influence, but he's also a starting point for Sinology. And in his day, I forget the name of the professional organization, but you know, there already was a French a sinological kind of association. He was one of the founding members. I hope that gives a good answer. I mean, you're the first person I think in the acknowledgements, and I owe Dr. Young a book. So I have to say that.
Always acknowledge your Dr. Bond. Always get tough questions. Chris.
Tom Harvey wrote an important work, Acquainted with Grief, on Wang Mingdao. And he actually is the person at the top of the back of my book, which indicates that this work is essential reading. And I think that Harvey's really great contribution was that he showed between 1949 to 1955 that a person's religious essence was connected to their political essence in China. And so his work was very important in teasing out that period between 1949 to 1955 that showed the incredible changes that happened in China as it went from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. And it was very focused on that period, whereas my work is an entire life biography. And so I would say Harvey's work is much more focused and my work is more broad. And I think both of them have a different contribution. Harvey's is really important, like I said, in teasing out how that took place, where a person's religious essence was connected to their political essence, and why he was imprisoned. Wang Mingdao was imprisoned during that period. That was very important. But this is I think, a broader picture of the life of Wang Mingdao.
Thank you. We have a question from Sharon Hart to Chris.
My mother-in-law.
Your mother-in-law. Another important person.
Very important.
Very important. And the question is, what was the missionary Christian theology of the day, and in what ways was it different from what you wrote about Wang Mingdao in your book?
I think you could answer the missionary Christian theology better than I can. I would say first read his book and then look at my book.
Two for the price of one. No,
Two
sorry.
for the price of one. I think what was really unique about what Wang Mingdao was doing as opposed to the missionaries was he was really trying to integrate Confucian morality and the Confucian stories of the past with the dynastic histories of China, with Christian theology. And he said, I agree 99% with Confucius' teachings, and there was a 1% of disagreement. And where there was 1% of disagreement, he would always go with the Christian teaching. That was a really definitive of him being a Confucian Christian. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to present, I think, you see that really at the end, Christianity as a Chinese religion. So he saw Christianity as the fulfillment of Confucianism. He did not see it as a separate tradition. And you don't really realize that until much later in his story. But looking back, you can see all along the way that that is working in his thinking. And so he thought that Confucius had taught the way to Chinese before the Christian missionaries came, who revealed that Jesus had fully taught the way. So I think it's a different understanding of the Chinese past than what the missionaries had, at least many missionaries. You could speak to that better than I can, Jonathan.
Well, I was just going to offer, I was reading your book, and one of the things I thought was both in your work and Harvey's work is that part of Wang Mingdao's, what makes him who he is that he separates from the missionaries because of different theological views. So that's a challenge maybe to the missionary movement, is sometimes the missionary movement would only support people if they agreed, with the denominational kind of theology and orthodoxy. So I thought that was an interesting, just having the biography, I feel like is very helpful for those of us who don't know him as well, because it provides some of that picture of how, and maybe in the world Christianity conversation, it's also the difference between traditional Protestantism and some of the new forms of Christianity that come in the 20th century. So.
I mean, I wonder if I could balance that question a little more directly to Jonathan, because of this narrative that Chris has introduced in this book for Mingdao of looking at Confucianism and Christianity. Of course, Morrison, he's engaging different Chinese classical works, right? And he's coining terms, theological terms, as he's trying to translate the Bible and as he's trying to produce Christian texts in Chinese, right? What was he? I mean, he perhaps was not as conscious of Confucianism or of Chinese ideas, religious, philosophical ideas in his turns towards like these terms and works. But in what ways was he negotiating that cultural religious pluralities?
Yeah, so. I mean, one of the questions we talk about is how you translate names. So I feel like that first generation, they try out kind of a lot of different things, and then they see what happens. So there's and I feel like sometimes the missionary, like an example is the Shan and Shangdi discussion. Is something where the missionaries make a really big deal out of this distinction, and it still has some place in local culture, but. Like I still hear the terms used interchangeably by local Christians, so, and I think Morrison's era, they didn't have as much of the three teachings like Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, but they had all these texts. So even now, like in Morrison's library, if you study, like it's still part of the London's collection. And it's still useful to contemporary sinologists, like if they work on morality texts or if they work on other, some of the Qing Dynasty books about how to live a good life, the Shanchu, the good books, and those traditions. So I think he was also kind of collecting a library and trying to understand like what do people believe. And I thought that was interesting, like the Liang Fa's book, Chen Shi Liang Yan. There are other books with similar titles in the morality book tradition. So, like when I first heard about Liang Fa's book, I heard it was a tract, and it kind of is like a British tract. It's about 400 pages long, and it's also like a morality book, and it's also a lot of scripture. Most of it's maybe 80%, 90% scripture. But I'm really curious in these hybrid traditions. And I also know us as foreigners, like anything I write in Chinese that's fluent has been edited by somebody else, and I think that's true of probably 99% of the foreigners I could be wrong about that. So I was interested in the collaborative nature of this work, like how did these two, especially this dyad of Morrison and Milne and early workers in the mission, how did they do that? I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's great. Chris, we have a question for you from Richard Fox-Young. So you're being examined right now in multiple directions. I'm pleasantly surprised to hear you describe Wang Mingdao as espousing a kind of fulfillment theology. Who might have shaped this kind of fulfillment approach? And I'm asking about sources and influences that you can think of.
In the book that I wrote, you see right from the beginning, he goes to school at a missionary school, Cui-Wan Academy in Beijing. And right from the start, he's memorizing the Analects and the 4 books of Confucianism. Particularly the Analects. And throughout his life, he references stories from the dynastic histories, particularly the Tang Dynasty. And so he's memorized these stories really early on. And later, when he writes The Last Confession, which is a request for rehabilitation to the government after he was imprisoned, he has glaucoma so severe that he's nearly blind, but he's writing in the preface to his request for rehabilitation to the government, massive quotations that he's memorized from the Analects, from the Doctrine of the Mean, from Mencius, from Xunzi. All these quotations he has memorized over the years. So the sources would be the 4 books of Confucianism, the 24 dynastic histories, and then the poetry of Wen Tianqiang. That was very meaningful to him in prison, especially, as well as the philosophy of Xunzi. So I think that those would be the really important sources that show, in addition to the Bible, which was what the source of his writings in the Spiritual Food Quarterly. That was the journal that he wrote from 1927 to 1955. The Bible was really the major source of that. But all the way through, as you see in different situations of conflict, the 4 books of Confucianism and the 24 dynastic histories lace his Christian theology. And that really comes to fruition in his request for rehabilitation to the government. I think because he thought writing to a government official, if he referenced biblical texts, they would have thought it was superstitious. So he used an enormous number of Confucian texts to try to prove his point and to show how righteousness, the pursuit of righteousness, what was right and good, was all the way through Chinese history. And he brings all of that to bear in this document. And so people who will only read the last 50 years, his first biography, or another 40 years, the second, really miss out on that fuller picture of Wang Mingdao. And so I wanted to present that in my book. Thanks.
Christie, did you want to join in? Oh, no, okay. Great. Well, I think we're coming up to our time.
How's that?
Yes, thank you very much. Richard just comes back just to say, in short, Wang Mingdao was not under the influence of any other theologian, necessarily Chinese or otherwise, in terms of shaping the idea of fulfillment.
As far as I know, no. I think it was his direct reading of ancient texts, particularly the 4 books and the dynastic histories of China. Now, that could be just something that I don't know about. But from what I've seen, he doesn't reveal a lot of his sources in some cases. So he translated a lot of English works into the Spiritual Food Quarterly, but those were mostly American works, not the Chinese ones. If he references a Chinese story, he's usually going right to the original source. So as far as I know, no.
I mean, I think it's interesting for Wang Mingdao, and as well as these early missionaries, that the reality is that it's a very religiously, culturally, plural reality that Christianity is coming into, right? As opposed to say the UK or the US, which for the most part has had a very long history as more or less a monolithic religious cultural history, right? Or I mean that's a little. Jonathan's like making faces at me. But the point is that even now as I've been in Taiwan for a few days, and I'm looking around, and there's like shrines and temples and to so many different religious cultural traditions, right? Confucius, Buddhist temples, Taoist temples of all sorts, even to different political military figures as well, and when you're in this water, what do you do? With Christianity, in some ways, it's almost a necessity to engage it in some way, right? And according to Wang Mingdao, his own sense is that was 99%.
99%.
99% Confucian. I mean, that's like not what I would have thought of, you know,
Right.
for this figure. And it'd be, I think, a surprise for many people in the house church movement today to say, wait, he's not Confucian, he's Christian.
Mhm.
You know, he's a Bible Christian.
Right.
It's not Confucian, you know, and you know, to have that kind of you know, jostle your mind, you know, and just, you know, challenge you, is really really important to be reminded of that context.
Mm.
And I think the same goes for Jonathan's work also in terms of, you know, just highlighting, you know, what Morrison and others are dealing with, you know, in their engagements. Well, this is about the time that we have. We have a note online from one Terry Payk, I presume of a relation here,
Yes.
that just gives thanks for this book launch and highlighting these important figures in Christianity in China, but really, I think I should say not only Christianity in China, but Christianity in this world, if you will, in terms of world Christianity and the implications beyond this place we call China, however you want to define that. And I think, you know, she notes, and I think it's important to recognize that, you know, in a way that these are academic works that highlight really great expressions of academic research into these subjects, but also that for many people, these works will be, I think, very important for those of Christian faith who see the value beyond the academics. And so both of these are really very well highlighted, very important, I think, in these works. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Mm.